починаємо наш захід. У нас сьогодні, ви вже зрозуміли, що у вас сьогодні дуже насичений день в плані інформації і розуміння, що таке законодавчий процес, що таке електронне врядування. І зараз я маю велику честь представити нашого сьогоднішнього високоповажного гостя, пана Пета Кокса, колишнього голову Європейського парламенту, голову оціночної місії Європейського парламенту з потреб самої Верховної Ради, і який в лютому цього року представив дуже ґрунтовний і системний звіт і надав 52 рекомендації Верховній Раді в плані її реформування. Наш захід буде відбуватися англійською мовою без перекладу, тому я сподіваюся, що ви всі англомовні, вас відбирали саме таким чином, щоб ви розуміли англійську мову на достатньому рівні. Тому, будь ласка, поважайте один одного, поважайте наших сьогоднішніх гостей. Я сподіваюся, що вам буде дуже цікаво. Mr. Cox, can I give you a word, please? Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I am very pleased to be in Kyiv. I did not expect, when I planned my visit, that it would be the day when the RADA would vote for a new government. So this, of course, makes my visit politically even more interesting than I expected. My meeting with you is the first item on my agenda. I just arrived at the airport and came directly to speak to you. I'm very pleased to be here, and I want to thank the organisers of today for including me in your program and for inviting me. It is common for people of my age, when speaking with people of your age, to say how important you are to the future of a society or a country. But in the case of Ukraine, even if these words risk to sound typical, I really do mean that this for me is a very important meeting. Your country is going through a very challenging time, and it needs all of the goodwill, of the active citizenship, of the idealism, and of the patriotism that you can bring as young people in your commitment to your country's future. There is a phrase which I quoted a few weeks ago in the European Parliament when we had the Ukrainian Week, and where we launched a document outlining proposals to reform Verkhovna Rada. This meeting was attended by the then Speaker and now Prime Minister, Mr. Groysman, and by the leaders of all the factions, and by the committee leaders. So there was a very high-level attendance from Verkhovna Rada. And I quoted there a phrase from a speech which was made on a cold winter morning in January 1961, on the day of the inauguration in Washington, D.C. in the United States of the then President, later assassinated, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And President Kennedy used a phrase in that speech. He said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what can you do for your country." And it seems to me, if there is a mission that you should have from being here, as a person and as a group, your mission should be to ask, in whichever way your life brings you, whether this is a life in politics, in commerce, in health services, in social services, in academic life, in media, wherever this could be, to keep in mind that question to yourself, to ask, what can you do for your country? Politics everywhere is contested. That's why we have governments and oppositions. And when we have elections, we have some contest of ideas. This policy versus some other policy, and ideally, that the electorate vote with some concern to do with the policy for the future of their country. But politics in your country is a good deal more complicated today than for many others. And so, when I read the many things that are not working, and you will know those things and we'll debate them here together, it is important to understand also the things which are working. This is not a black or a white picture, but many shades of grey. Not everything is perfect, not everything is bad. And something which makes your politics very complicated is that now, 25 years into your independence as Ukraine, you have had some extraordinary events in the short life of your independent republic. I think the most significant event which you've had has been the revolution of dignity in Maidan. This has set from the people of Ukraine a very high bar. You can imagine if you were in athletics and having to jump a high jump. Maidan put the bar high. The people said, out with the old ways, out with the past, bring forward for us a new future. And that bar has been set high. And that is a good thing. If you want to aim and to achieve, aim high and you will achieve maybe higher than you had originally expected. But when you set the bar very high, the expectations many times can be almost of what I might call instant fulfillment. But politics is not like the light switch at the back of the room, where you switch on the new light and the new policy flows. It takes time and it is complicated. Maidan has set the challenge and the bar high, and this is good. But this makes the expectations on politics in Ukraine tougher, harder, higher than the bar in most political systems. Because most political systems have not had, as you did in such a short period ago, the revolution of dignity. The second thing that you have, which is extraordinary, and I'm very pleased to hear that among your gathering today are people from the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, I think, and from Crimea, and this is really important, that you have a trauma, you have a set of events in your country that no other European country has today, because you have a neighbour who has annexed one part of your country and who fuels the separatist war in the other part. And this makes politics here also really challenging. There is no other country, and certainly none in the European Union today, where the territory of the state is itself being disputed in an aggressive way by a neighbour. And that is very demanding and very different in your politics today. You have a society and an economy and good people in terms of their qualities who are reaching out to try to assist with all the people who have been displaced by the war, who had to move to other parts of Ukraine and to try to make, for the moment, a fresh start. And you've had to deal with all of the drama of the dead and the injured of this period. You also have in your politics all of the complications about the Minsk peace process. It is a very tense, very difficult arrangement that has made some progress, but really has yet to achieve the objectives that were set for it. And I get reports every day from Ukraine and follow them closely. And I can tell you unhappily that every other day I read of wounded Ukrainian servicemen or even dead Ukrainian servicemen with this peace protocol in operation. But I read it in these reports. I don't read it in my newspaper, because it's not as bad as it had been in August of 2014, so it's not in the international headlines. But here in Ukraine, it has not gone away. And so this too greatly complicates your political process. This has obliged you in a period of economic crisis because of the war, because of the loss of output in your economy, because of the rate of inflation, which happily is coming down but remains still very high, and because of the devaluation in your currency, all connected to this crisis. This has put great economic pressure on managing your economy. But in managing that economy, you've had to take a big slice of this smaller economic cake and place it in security and defence. You might prefer to put it in education or health or welfare programs. But because of the war, you don't have a choice. And so a big slice of a smaller cake goes to security and defence for those kinds of reasons. And this economic shock is spilling over in a significant way. When we put all of this together, it makes politics in Ukraine, through these features, more demanding than it is in many other places. And then you have a feature in Ukraine which is not unique, but you have a specific or a unique form of this in your country. And that is the power of what people call vested interests. So the oligarch power. If every country has, at some level, some very rich people, but they're not necessarily, in the way you have here in Ukraine, politically powerful people. They are economically powerful people because they run large enterprises. But you have a kind of a grey space between the interest of the oligarchs and the interests of the state, and the dividing line between business and politics. And frankly, what your generation needs to hope for and to work for is that oligarchs, if they want, will do business, and politicians who've been elected will do politics, but that the politician's job is to try to understand and find what is the real national interest, not what is the interest of some certain part of society. And this can be addressed, but it will take time. And that's why your generation is very important to think about how should the future of your society and your politics be shaped. Because the mistakes of the past, if they are not corrected, will remain as the mistakes of the future. But you have the benefit to look to the past, to learn from the past, and to find a better way for the future. The last thing I want to talk to you about is the whole issue surrounding corruption, some part of which is related to my earlier comment, but not all. A point that I want to make to you, which I think is very important, is to try to draw a distinction between weak systems which are corrupt and good people who should not be painted in the same way. It's very easy, particularly if you live outside Ukraine, with the many stories about corruption and the nature of the prosecution or the court system, to kind of paint all of Ukraine in the same brushstroke, to say Ukraine equals corruption. And that is too much, because I sit here with you and you don't equal this. You represent some kind of hope in yourself and hope for the future of your country. And so it's very important to understand that in most societies, if you look at their history, you will find periods of very high levels of corruption in the early development of capitalism or politics. But what they did was they built strong institutions, independent institutions, as the answer. When you have strong and independent institutions of the state that do their job properly, without fear about political interference, or without doing favors for particular people or interests, strong institutions are the guarantee to take down and take out the worst practices of corruption. And this leads me to the work I had the privilege to do at RADA, which I'm not going to develop now at great length. We have a report, and it's available on the website of the European Parliament in both English and Ukrainian. So if you're interested, you can find the report, and we will make sure, if you don't have the web address, that we will give you that address to find the report if you wish. I want to make one point about the report. This is a report that recognizes many things can be done to modernize and develop the work of RADA. It cannot be done by foreigners. We could advise, analyze, or assist. But this country is Ukraine, an independent republic with its own constitution and its own elected representatives. And only their ownership of reform can make it work. That foreigners might suggest it makes no difference, because this is not my country, it's not my mandate, I wasn't elected, and it's not my parliament. So the really important thing is that RADA would take ownership and do these reforms, assisted by others, of course, but that they would take ownership. And I'm very pleased to say that a resolution of was passed, of the RADA, to take on this program, and we will have discussions now in our visit, hopefully to set up a working group to begin to take ownership of and to drive the reform. But the point I wish to make is that strong institutions, and the Parliament should be one of those, that does its job in a fair, open, transparent and good way, is the way you build the alternative and new Ukraine. A strong judicial system where judges are meant to be free of bias and political influence. A strong but independent prosecution system. A strong and independent ombudsman's office. A strong and independent accounting chamber. When these are strong and free to do their proper work, you create the conditions that guarantee the way towards change. And I know one thing, there is so much when you come to talk in areas like this, that Maidan, as I said earlier, has set a very high bar, and people want something to happen very quickly, and they're right to want to see early change. But frankly, these things also take time. And to get the answer right, to make the change from today to tomorrow, is the work of a generation. And it is your generation's privilege, challenge, and responsibility to be the ones to insist on this, so that you can be the generation to benefit from a new republic with reformed institutions focused ideally on the public good of the many and not on the interests of the few. And this is possible for your country as it has been possible for many others. But it is only possible if good people raise their voices and use their vote and use their citizenship to help bring these things about. So that is what I wanted to say to you. And it is a really great, great privilege for me to be able to meet you today and to start this two-day official visit, first with you and later with everyone else we should meet. I'm happy now to take any questions or comments, and you are free to ask anything, including if it's nothing to do with what I say. Also, please understand, and do understand this, there is no such thing as a stupid question. If you have a question, ask it. You may get from me a stupid answer, but please ask anything that you have on your mind. So it's a completely open session, and between now and 4:30 we have 1 hour, and you are now in charge of what you want to do and how you would like to use my time with you. And thank you very much for listening so attentively.
Будь ласка, за правом піднятої руки, будь ласка, його.
Good afternoon. I've been time in Ukrainian Parliament, and thank you for your speech first. And I have a question concerning your future, because you're already the second time here, and there was 2 missions from European Parliament. And what next? Maybe the 3rd mission, because we have a lot of things to reform in our country.
Well, our mission to Verkhovna Rada is based on a memorandum of understanding which was signed on behalf of Verkhovna Rada by Mr. Groisman and on behalf of European Parliament by President Schulz. And this was signed in July of last year. I then had the privilege to be invited by both of them to lead what we call a needs assessment mission. We made here, myself and a number of senior members of staff of the European Parliament, assisted here by Tim, who sits at my left. We made a large number of visits. We had over 100 meetings where mostly we listened. We listened to what members had to say, what administration had to say, what the chairman of committees had to say, what the group leaders had to say to us, the faction leaders. And out of that, hours and hours of listening, we produced a report based on what we were told. So we did not arrive here saying, we know all the questions and we know all the answers. We didn't do this. We said, we know lots of models of different systems that work in different places, but we need to hear from you. What do you want here? So your question then, what next? At the Ukrainian Week in the European Parliament, for the first time in its history, the European Parliament signed an administrative agreement with the Secretariat of RADA. And so these two administrations will work on an agenda for the European administration to assist the RADA administration in terms of modernising its administrative capacity, its communication system, its e-parliament and e-democracy initiatives, and so on. So there's a very big body of work there. The second thing is that we are looking in these discussions now to see when and how will the RADA set up its working group, which it voted in a resolution, and who will be on that working group, and how will we work with them to achieve the timetable or calendar of change which we had identified in our 100 meetings. The European Union will invest considerable money in assisting this in a technical and expert way. And this will not be done only as a European Parliament or a European Union project. USAID, which is deeply involved in RADA for so many years, is working with this exercise. The UNDP on the United Nations side is working with this exercise. The embassies of Switzerland, Norway, Canada, United States are working with this exercise. So this will be a collection of international partners who will need to put their hand up to say, we will do this piece, or we will do some other piece, and that we put a package together to try to assist this process. But in the end, the speed, the depth, and the quality of what happens depends on the votes of the RADA. Everybody from the outside can bring goodwill, insight, and hopefully sufficient funds to assist. But nobody outside Ukraine owns the process. This can only work if it is owned by Ukrainians themselves, which is why our mission here to meet with now the new Prime Minister, to meet now with the new Speaker of RADA, to meet with the EU and US ambassadors, and to meet with USAID, UNDP and others, is the next step in putting the building blocks together. I am hopeful that we will proceed on that road. This is not because all the other things I mentioned are secondary. Fixing the economy, bringing down the inflation rate, dealing with the security situation, negotiating Minsk, all those things are high priorities. But what we're saying is that the parliamentary reform is it's not binary. It's not yes or no. It's not black or white. It's not either or. It's both. All those other things have to happen, but this has to happen also in parallel. And that's what we're hoping we can confirm in our visit, that the appetite for this reform programme will remain, even if some of the personalities change the positions of politics and influence that they are in. And we will hope to work with the interns and others to be agents and voices for this kind of change within the institution.
Sorry. Good afternoon. I don't know will it question stupid or not, but I try to ask. In your speech, you have mentioned about a next premier, and I'm from Romania. And what can I read in today news? Two parliamentarians from European Parliament have visited in Crimea now, in some conference, and how I should react to this. What is your comment and what I can to say to my friend in Crimea, to my relatives? Thank you very much.
Let me take a few questions so that we can get the largest number in.
My name is Natalia. According to your political experience, how many time we need for extremely changing Ukrainian system and Ukrainian life for Ukrainian people, and how to bring Ukraine for highest level in general? How many times? 1 year? What we have to expect? 2, 3? Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Irina, and the topic of our project is e-government. So I'm interested in your position of this topic. How do you think? What advantages of e-government, and how is the effective way? What is the effective way of implement it in Ukraine?
And the last one. Thank you for your confidence, for your belief in Ukraine, but I have some concern. And could you please tell what is the opinion, the attitude of European leaders, officials after Panama Gate, which is where Petro Poroshenko is some person which is associated with that scandal? What can you tell? Is it an impeding block for confidence in our government, in our president in particular? Thank you.
Happily, when I was doing all this work in the RADA, I was dealing with the issues of what the reform might be, but not with the issues of politics. But I'm happy to take all your questions. Firstly, the young man who spoke from Crimea, I could see already your magnetic personality was getting in touch with the electronics. You ask a good question. I can give you my personal answer. I should tell you, by the way, I am myself now just an ordinary citizen. I'm not elected, I'm not a member of European Parliament, but I have been there in the past, and I've been the President of the Parliament. This Parliament has 751 deputies, if you count the President. And in a Parliament so big and so diverse in its politics and in its makeup by nationality, you will get all shades of opinion. All that I can tell you is that the institution's position, the Parliament when it speaks as an institution, through its resolutions which it votes, by a huge majority, rejects the annexation of Crimea and deplores visits of the sort of which you speak. So, by the biggest majority, members of the European Parliament would deplore visits of this sort that are made using the fact that someone is in the Parliament and giving a certain credibility. All I would say to you is, in the eyes of their colleagues, these people's actions are deplored. Of course, if I was a propagandist in Yalta or in wherever they should make their visit, I would be sending the propaganda back to Moscow and through Moscow elsewhere to say, oh, look, European Parliament comes to Crimea. No. 2 members of European Parliament came, but the institution, no. I guarantee you, you will not see the President of the European Parliament representing that institution in Crimea in the circumstances of today, or the group leaders of the main political groups, because they deplore and condemn the annexation. So my answer, my personal answer, is this happens in life, but do not confuse the freelance activity of a small number of deputies with the full weight of an institution which believes, as I'm sure you do, that this annexation is unacceptable. And if you speak to family and friends, try to explain to them at least the distinction. The two do not speak for the institution, even if they are elected members of the institution. It could be, for example, if some members of RADA should make a speech in favour of what has happened in Crimea. I don't think they would make such a speech today, but if they did, they don't represent RADA. They may represent themselves, but they would not represent RADA, and that is the distinction. Natalia asked the question about how much time. I think to do with Maidan, the expectation is to do very much and do it very quickly, of course. And this is why I said the bar is very high. In reality, to change systems, to change what I might call culture, attitudes, and behaviour, doesn't happen so quickly, which is why I'm so pleased to speak to a group of young Ukrainians. Because you could, in theory, change the law tomorrow on some problematic area. And you could hang that law in the window like a nice curtain for everyone to see and say, oh, look at that, it's beautiful. But it might change no behaviour. So changing the law is only one part of the journey to changing the behaviour, the attitudes and the culture. And these things, because they are embedded, they are deep, they have their roots in the system, are not changed overnight. So one part of my answer to you, which is the deeper part, about behaviour, attitudes and culture, about values, and which value do you place the highest? The Kennedy quotation. What can you do for your country, not what can your country do for you? This, frankly, in a certain way, and this is not to depress you, but this is why I like talking to a group like you, this is the work of a generation, not just the work of one convocation of the RADA, but the work of several convocations. This is not to argue for complacency. Many things must be done now. Do not misunderstand what I'm telling you. But even as you do them, changing behaviour and changing attitudes, that takes longer. If I can give an example, I live in Ireland, which is an island, but a small country. And both as geography, in terms of size and population, Ukraine is a much, much bigger country. We had, as many countries have had, we've had debates about rights for gays and lesbians. I take that issue because I know there's been lots of controversy also here about such an issue. I'm not here getting involved in your debate. This is for Ukraine to figure out what Ukraine wants to do. Eventually, we changed the law in Ireland to do with homosexuality in 1991. And we had an old law that went back to the time of Queen Victoria, when Ireland was ruled by Britain, going back to the 1840s or 1850s, which criminalised all such behaviour. And then we removed and changed that law. Does that mean overnight that everybody in this conservative society feels very open towards the gay community? The answer is no. The law change was very significant. It sent a signal. But the attitude and behaviour changes, they come more slowly. And so just last year, in May, we had a referendum in Ireland to see if the citizens would allow that the definition of marriage should be open to include whoever wishes to marry of whichever gender. And this quite conservative society from the past, because it's been living slowly with understanding its own society, voted by a large majority to permit marriage without it being gender specific. Now, 1991 and 2016, that's 25 years. So the attitude journey from something which was criminal to something which was decriminalized, which became civil partnership sometime, and then the right to marry, that's been a generation journey. Because a younger generation, I don't speak of that issue, but a younger generation may have a different view of issues than an earlier one, and so it takes time. Let me say, however, so to give you an example, in 1991, in December, you voted for independence. And I look at everyone sitting here, many of you were probably not born at that stage, as I look around. Also, this was the time, a few years after, the Berlin Wall had collapsed. And after the countries of Central Europe came away from the Soviet bloc. You were in the Soviet Union, but Poland was in Soviet bloc. In 1991, Poland and Ukraine were very similar on three things that I will tell you. They're just a quick measure of economy or health. One was on the income per head. Poland and Ukraine were very close. The second was on infant mortality, a little indirect measure of health. How many infants per 1,000 infants who are born die in their first year? That's called the rate of infant mortality, the death rate of very young babies. Poland and Ukraine were very similar in 1991. And longevity, how long did you live after you were born, on average? Poland and Ukraine were very similar in 1991. Today, infant mortality in Poland is 1/3 of the rate of Ukraine. Today, if you're Polish, you will live on average 8 or 8.5 years longer than Ukrainians. And today in Poland, your income per head in real terms is more than 2.5 times what it is in Ukraine. Now, the question, is this because everyone in Poland is very smart and everyone in Ukraine is very stupid? Could be a question. Or is this because the systems transformed in Poland but haven't fully transformed in Ukraine? And I don't put the answer down to smart Polish and stupid Ukrainians. I put the answer down to better systems and bad systems. And the Polish transformation, which took a generation. Now, of course, in Poland, their politics is very contested. They still fight over many things in politics. But the statistics I'm giving you, these are not a contest. These are real. It happened in a generation, and it was a transformation, a changing generation. And so that's my answer to you. It's not to say don't keep pushing now for what must happen, but understand that underneath it, the social change, cultural change, behavioral change, and the results you get, like the Poland-Ukraine example, take time. But what Poland proves, when you start the journey to proper reform, you end up in a better place for the society. Better that less infants die. Better that on average you live longer and healthier. And better when you're living, that you should have a bit more money to spend. And those three things are real statistics to do with that transformation. The e-government question is a very good question. And here I would say some parts of the reform that have been already accomplished maybe don't get sufficient credit. Already in the period since Maidan, you have moved to a system of e-public procurement. So for applying to do public jobs, you put in your e-tender. This makes the system transparent, open in principle to anyone who can fulfill the service, and difficult, if not impossible, to misuse behind closed doors. And so the e-procurement system is one of the tools already in existence to rob the crooks who did this business behind closed doors and who made profits by not what they know, but who they know. The e-tender, e-procurement system is already a very good example of one part of e-government. The other parts that you could expect for all sorts of services. If you must tax a car, or if you must pay your own income tax, this can be done by e-government when the systems are developed. Custom services. The more you put those into electronic system, the less the custom system can cheat. And so these systems are in the process of being developed and they're important. And then of course you have the e-Parliament, which is about the openness of a democratic institution. Can you go and see, how did your deputy vote? What did your people's deputy say? Which are the laws being discussed? Which are the amendments being discussed? Is it possible to have an e-contact with your elected representative? These two are developing. Already since our mission started, but this was happening. It's not because of our mission. Mr. Groisman had already found some resources to invest in some new hardware. The computer system in the Parliament, by modern standards, was very old. In fact, by modern computer standards, was even quite ancient. They were 16 years old or whatever, but no one uses 16-year-old computers because they're too slow. So these kinds of things don't again happen overnight, but this is a commitment, and one of the things we want to see develop, and you will see in our report, is the e-Parliament part. But I think in general, the openness of the e-government system can be one of the tools to combat the hidden hand which took the money from the pocket of the Ukrainian citizen behind closed doors. And therefore I'm a big supporter of it, and I'm glad that you have some working group here that looks at that. Then the case about Panama, which was asked. Let me take two things, because that of course came up in the final days of the Dutch referendum. And when I followed the media reports here in Ukraine, I see that you have a very active debate about whether some way Ukrainians are to blame for the Dutch no vote because of Panama or whichever other reason. I would say to you, I will come to Panama, but just to say something on the Dutch vote. I believe that the Dutch referendum came about, and this is admitted, by a group of skeptical people about European Union who wanted to find some popular way to send a hostile or negative signal to their government and to Brussels, to the European Commission, to the European Parliament. And Ukraine was the instrument that they used. The Dutch who voted no, and most Dutch didn't vote, but the ones who voted no, in my view, were primarily motivated by Euroscepticism, more than they were motivated by being against Ukraine. So Ukraine, I would say, was used or instrumentalized inside the Dutch political debate using a new system, so-called popular democratic initiative, where if enough citizens asked, there could be a vote. And while I can see the debate you have in Ukraine about corruption, Panama and so on, my own feeling that the people who wanted the vote in Holland and the people who argued most strongly were the ones who are really making a Eurosceptical point more than they were making an anti-Ukrainian point. And now the Dutch government has to try to figure out what to do next. The one thing I can tell you is that the European commitment to Ukraine, to the association agreement and to the trade agreement, will not go away. How the Dutch will handle this politically with the rest, we would probably have to wait for a few months until it calms down and they do some thinking. On the Panama case, most of the publicity that I have seen has focused, because Panama has produced 11 million documents, has focused on lots of people. And your president's case was one of many, and not necessarily in the Western media the one that got the most publicity. So it's there among many. That's the first point to make. The second thing is that in the Panama evidence, we've only what we saw in the newspapers, as to which things are legal and which things are not, is hard to separate without having all the facts. I think that the dilemma for your president was that he had promised to the people of Ukraine that he would separate himself in his presidency away from his business and towards his politics. And it would appear that that separation may not have taken place when first it was thought in public, but now apparently after Panama is confirmed to have taken place. And that is an embarrassment. But in the end of the day, we're just about, in fact today, we're starting with a new government and a new possibility. This is not to wipe clean everything that went before. This is not what I mean by new. I mean that this government now has a very big responsibility to take the Maidan challenge, the high bar, and to stay focused on what that means. Because the public has only so much patience. And at some moment, when the public loses hope, or if the public gets annoyed, who knows what will then happen. So I think for democracy in Ukraine, democracy must be seen to deliver what is needed. And I hope that the new government will, in a very visible way, be seen to do that. Because it is that which keeps democracy strong and healthy at the heart of Ukrainian life. And it would be a great pity to see it undermined by cynicism or by failure. And I think that is the big challenge, not really just from the Panama case, but from this whole period. There have been good things, as I said, the e-tendering is a great example. But there needs to be more good things. And then you have the huge dilemma, and here you have a very difficult politics of limited budgets and huge demands by society for health, education, and welfare. You need to guard as young people. Simple solutions are good if you can find them. But you need to guard against oversimplification. It's very easy, I could do a political speech, very populist, to tell you all the things you want to hear if you're a group of pensioners. I could do a speech of here in the blue t-shirts, everybody is a student in the university. I could go to the next table, if the orange were all the agricultural sector, I could give the speech that they want to hear. Sometimes in politics, if you're giving real leadership, you have to give the speech that people don't really want to hear. But if you spend long enough explaining, that they understand. And that's a very difficult challenge if some politicians always go out to tell you only what you want to hear. Because in the end, the cake which is available can have only so many slices. It is in the nature of economic resources that in any society, from the poorest to the richest, that they are limited. And finally, to connect that back, not to Panama, but maybe to Cyprus, I was very surprised several years ago when I read that the largest foreign direct investment source of investment in Ukraine was Cyprus. And of course, when I looked at it, that's because so many Ukrainian corporations put their money in Cyprus and avoid all sorts of payment requirements in Ukraine. And to do with your generation, you have to insist on cleaning up Ukrainian business practice. You cannot keep milking the Ukrainian cow until it runs dry. And under the old system, that's a real risk. Because you need the system to be fair, so that when you ask the little people to make their sacrifice, that you ask the big people also to visibly make theirs. Okay, any more questions? We have a bit of time left still.
I have two questions. The first one is, what are the main problems of Ukrainian society, not Ukrainian government? And which steps should make the Ukrainian young generation to solve such problems? And the next one is, when Ukraine will be the part of the European Union? If we will be the part of European Union. Thanks.
We are collecting.
Yes.
Good afternoon. Nowadays, a lot of simple citizenships of Ukrainian citizenships are really afraid of the past government and the Ukrainian power, which get every year a lot of credits from different international institutions. Moreover, West countries such as European Union, European countries, United States, and West world spend a lot of money in Ukraine as financial support, charity, and sponsorship. And the question is why the European Union, the West world, don't control the final road of this money and don't control the road of these reforms. And as I understand, the European Union and West countries have a lot of influence on nowadays Ukrainian government and Ukrainian power.
Hi, and in your opinion, Ukraine becomes a big chess, a big battleground of ideologies and sword of democracy on the border of European Union.
Thank you very much, first of all, everything you do for Ukraine, for your faith, and thank you very much for trust in us and encouragement. And my question is about two questions. First, about our society and the problems. The main, perhaps, problem is corruption, but it's the result. We call ourselves very moral and good people, but in fact, on the West, it's very simple. If you don't have, if you just have shop without seller or in church, candles, you can just give money and take exactly what you want. In our society, people try to get as much as they want, not to pay, and I don't know, to go in buses, through buses, etc., without and so on. And how can we decide this problem? Because that's the huge layer. And in Polish, they said they have had the same situation. And they say they just have too much payments for corruption, for everything. And you said about values first and about system. But for example, in our system, if we have such problems, someone can just pay, just find someone, and it will be just a decision on another level of this problem. It's not a decision, and we have such situation. About the second question, some people say that perhaps it's better for us not to be the member of European Union if it's impossible or true, but associated. What do you think about that?
So let me take those questions. The society question, I think, is a very interesting one, and one where I would make some effort to answer, but I don't regard myself, because I mostly meet your institutions when I am here, I don't regard myself in the day-to-day sense as having an expert view on some of the elements in day-to-day living, so the society question. I think something which is important to understand, and your being here and doing an exercise like this is an example of what I want to say, is how systems have been designed, how they've evolved over time. So a centrally planned communist system or the market economy, liberal democracy kind of system. The second kind, the one typical in the West, with many variations between different countries, is one where the citizen has rights, but where the system expects the citizen also to recognize responsibilities. And so there is a balance between the right and the responsibility. A second element in systems terms is that a lot of what you do, of course you will rely on the state for many things, the education system, the health system, the public transport system. But in many cases, you also need to rely quite a bit on yourself, on what you do, on your motivation and your training, and you have a system that encourages a degree of personal independence. If you have an older style system with lots of centrally planned welfare, you have a system which is stronger on dependency, where the citizen depends on the system. So I think the big societal thing for your generation is the journey from an older style, controlled and centrally planned dependency system into a better educated, more self-confident, self-reliant independency system. Not so independent that you're not an active citizen, but that you don't depend on the state for everything. And this journey from dependency to independency, I think, is one of the ones that in particular is the societal journey of your generation. That you find your own feet, that you do your own walking, more than would be the case perhaps under the system with an earlier generation. I don't mean that you didn't have such personalities in people before in Ukraine, but the system was one in which central planning and societal dependency were kind of linear, top down. This system is more organic. It grows a bit from the bottom up. And I think that is the society of your future, the civil society organizations, your willingness to engage as a citizen. If I could take a small example, I'm on the board of a charitable foundation in Ireland which deals with the question of aging, of older people. And lots of times in societies, the debate about older people is almost like they're a kind of a burden. You know, you have all the health costs and the pension and the welfare cost. And these things can be true. But also, older people have a whole life experience, and if they're still healthy, many things that they can contribute. So one of our programs, we today have 90 centres in Ireland with 800 volunteers teaching English language twice each week to 2,100 immigrants who have no English language skill, free of charge. And these are older people willing to do this, who take from it more than they give to it because they're so pleased to be involved in something useful. They're older people who live, like you, all over, not just in the capital city, but all over the country. And so when they meet the immigrant on the street, here is an older person who lived all their life there, waving and saying hello to them by their name. And it begins in an informal way to help them to integrate. We started that because a wonderful woman who had seen a conversation in a supermarket with a young mother and young children. The young mother was under a lot of pressure and she had no English. She couldn't tell what she was thinking in that shop, in the language. And this lady, instead of looking away, saying, well, that's not my business, just with sign language, tried to help the mother at that counter and came to the idea, because she was involved with old people, why do I not ask some of my older friends to teach this lady to speak English? That was one woman looking at one woman that has turned out a program which is now national and voluntary. No one is paid €1 to do anything in this. This taking of responsibility is not given by the government. It's not given by the law. It's the gift you give to yourself and that you give back to your society. And that's what I think should be the big difference generationally for your generation and the next generation. I will join your question to another part of one of the other questions about Ukraine and the European Union. The when question, the honest answer today to your question is there's no specific date and yet no specific agenda. And if it happens, it will be at some future date, and therefore certainly a date of relevance to your generation. Right now, there's such a journey to go that even if, this has not been said, if the European Union said, yes, we would foresee a membership of Ukraine, this would not happen quickly. Even with the states who are in, it takes a long time. The last state to join was Croatia, and that had been negotiating for a very long number of years. And the same thing at some moment, if that was agreed in principle, also would happen with Ukraine. But I think the things to work on now, so the immediate things, are to try to get on with the renewal and reform process, and to try, among other things, to fulfill the conditions required for the visa liberalisation. Because I think it's very important, again, for your generation, if you can afford to do it, because the hryvnia is now so low, it makes the travel abroad very expensive, I know this. But if things improve, it's very important that you feel European, that you feel you have your passport from Ukraine, and that brings you to where you wish to go. That's a very important thing. If you're a young person who can afford to study outside Ukraine, and more that is difficult again, especially with value of the hryvnia today, you feel this passport should take you to the places you wish to go. And I hope that's the first visible thing that can be done, because this is an individually owned openness. It's not about the whole system, it's about you travelling to where you wish to go. And I hope that will be one of the first things. On the question of EU, United States, the International Monetary Fund, kind of controlling Ukraine, and then the other words were used in other questions. I think the word control would be the wrong word, and I think the word influence would be more correct. As I said to you about the reforms that we've suggested for Verkhovna Rada, they can only work if the Verkhovna Rada wishes to make them work. They won't work because I think they're a good idea, because I don't have even one vote. What we could try to do is to influence good people to do good things, and to assist them to do those things if they wish to do it. But this is not control. If Verkhovna Rada says, thank you very much, we're not doing that, I would be very disappointed. But it's not my answer, because I am not the one in control. Will you do all the reforms that are necessary in your justice system, in your prosecution system, in your fight against corruption, you will control the answer to that. Others will try to influence, to encourage. But no one in the United States and no one in the European Union is going to pass the laws and change the attitudes which belong correctly in Ukraine. They can assist, they can advise, but they do not control. I think one of your most difficult areas in this, and this does touch on citizens in a very real way, is that your economy today, with all of the challenges that I spoke about at the beginning, with the war that has been happening, with the loss of income that has happened because of the annexation and because of what happens in Donbass, your economy has suffered a lot. And if you didn't have this international financial assistance, the economy would have toppled off the edge. If you could regard the table like a cliff, it would have fallen over the cliff top to do with public finance. And so the money that you've been given doesn't make you rich. It just keeps things ticking over. You still pay teachers, you still pay doctors, you still pay nurses, because the ability to pay exists in those funds. But the funds are given with conditionality. And the conditionality is because they are the funds of someone else's taxpayer coming to Ukraine, and they want to see them used in a correct way. I would again say, in finding the right language, that conditionality is not the same thing as control. But when your own economy is not fully in your own control, sometimes you have to accept the conditions. If you went as a student to a bank and said, I'm a very intelligent student and I wish to go to United Kingdom to study for a degree, and I want you to help to finance me, the bank will give you conditions. How much can you pay back over how many years and so on. And you are free to say yes or no. But if you do the deal with the bank, then you have to accept the conditions because you also got the benefit. And so this part today in Ukraine is one of the elements of engagement which is conditional. And in the end, if Ukraine fulfills the conditions, the flow of funds remains. And that, of course, as you know, you've been following this, has been one of the issues between so-called international community and recently public policy in Ukraine. The question, Ukraine, an ideological battleground on the border of the EU and so on. Here there is a very interesting, I would say, philosophical difference if you view Ukraine from Moscow or you view Ukraine from Western Europe. I think I could summarize to say, viewed from Moscow, that what happens with Ukraine is what mathematicians would call a zero-sum game. They win, we lose. It's a system where there's no win-win formula. If Ukraine becomes more independent in the path it follows, we lose. And the win-lose formula is a zero-sum game. Viewed from Western capitals, the engagement with Ukraine is a positive-sum game. That everyone can win something from it, because everybody can make an advance together. And so these two philosophies of whether you're dealing with a positive-sum game, win-win, or a zero-sum game, there's winners and losers, explains in a somewhat abstract way two very different views of Ukraine. My view to do with this question is that you live in an independent republic. You have your own constitution. And with all the challenges that you still have, you have the right as a free people to choose your path. And if you make that choice, you have the right in international law to have that choice respected by others. And in the case of Crimea and the separatist war in Donbass, you have been partly denied the choice by your neighbour Russia, whose view is that you may be independent, but you're not really free to choose. And this is a profound question as to what your view as Ukrainians is. Do you have the right as a nation to take the steps to do with your own future as a nation and your own identity? Now, this is not about being anti-Russian. Please do not misunderstand me. It's not about, in my case, I come from Ireland, as I told you. We've been celebrating in recent weeks the 100th anniversary of a failed revolution in Dublin against British imperial control in Ireland. I do not find in my identity as an Irish person today any sense of being anti-British as a requirement to be Irish. What I would say to you in the choice that you've made to try to look to something modern, to try to look towards the West for some inspiration and change, is that you've made a collective choice not to be less Ukrainian, but to be more effective as Ukrainians than if you looked the other direction. And it's about how effective can you be as Ukrainians. And you have the right to make that choice. And in that sense, I don't see it as the zero-sum ideological battleground. I see it potentially as a positive-sum game. I actually think if Ukraine, and I hope and believe this can be the case, succeeds in this journey of modernization, that being so close historically and culturally to Russia, your example could be the biggest threat to Russia's own oligarchic powers, precisely because you would show it can be done, and it could be done in this region. But this is the big test, which is still being tested out in the evolution of your politics and economy. On the question about corruption and people's expectations and so on, you have some of the corruption is, I don't know how I put it, of Olympic standard and would win kind of Olympic gold medals in terms of corrupting behaviour. But I think the question was further down the line, what I might call the petty corruptions, that you want to get bumped up on the medical list, or you want to get to a better place in a college, or whatever the thing might be. So it's not the high Olympic standard corruption, but it's still there. That's a real problem in a certain way. In a republic where things are working normally, in principle, the ideal is that each citizen should have equal access to public service because it is their right. Because each citizen should pay their taxation, oligarchs included, because it is their responsibility. And when you balance rights with responsibilities, you have the space that challenges the practice of or the necessity for corruption. And I do come back to a point I made at the beginning. I think a lot of this debate in Ukraine is not about bad people, but bad systems, which is why I insist that the question of reforming institutions matters so much. Because you have to challenge bad systems to allow better practices to prevail for good people to find this balance of rights and responsibilities. And I think that on the European Union thing, I've tried to answer that. Currently, there is not a proposal for the Ukraine to join the European Union. It is clear that Ukrainian political leadership has this perspective in their mind. And right now, I think the battles to be won are the battles of reform of today. And the first visible sign I hope to see sooner and not later is the visa liberalisation. That doesn't change your life overnight because, as I said, you can't easily afford to travel maybe with the value of hryvnia. But what it does creates for you the possibility as a citizen to exercise your independent choices without additional barriers being put in the way. I think we may be running out of time. Can we take maybe one or two quick questions just to wrap up then?
Hello, my name is Andrew. I'm intern of Presidential Administration, and I have a question about relationship between European Union and Ukraine. As we know, in all relationship, all participants must have some benefit. For example, it's very simple in a relationship between man and woman. He make money and she make food and all are happy. Yeah. But in a relationship between European Union and Ukraine, it's more difficult. As we know, some countries want to lock out from European Union, some countries want to lock in. And my question is, for your opinion, what three main benefits will have Ukraine in this relationship, and what expected European Union from Ukraine? What three main benefits will have European Union? Thank you.
You explained that European Union is doing a lot for changing the system, changing the institution, and we know that there are a lot of programs, a lot of projects that European Union is doing in Ukraine, just trying to change the system. And you're also saying that it takes some time, the things will not happen overnight. Unfortunately, if we ask usual citizens in Ukraine about these projects, about this program, not many of them know what's going on in this level and what kind of programs the European Union is doing to change the Ukraine to bring it to the European standards. That's why I feel that European Union is not doing enough to work with the civil society. There is no enough, actually there is no real dialogue between European Union and citizens. Do you think that European Union more for civil society, for just normal citizens? I expect that there would be any program for citizens to know more about the European Union, for researchers to take part in the European research program, for institutions to be, closer to the education system. I expect that it will help to change the situation much quicker, and if people will trust, will know more about the European Union, about the benefits, the things here can happen much earlier than we used to hear. I think the European Union somehow can influence just to keep it up the citizens, civil society, not only better on system, institutions, politicians. What do you think?
Thank you. I'll take those two questions. My apologies if there are other people, but I have a schedule to meet with EU Ambassador in another location in a few minutes' time. Maybe I need to ask him this question also. The question of EU-Ukraine and the relationship. Let me tell you a very interesting thing. Just in the little picture you painted, that the man earns the money and the woman cooks the food. This already is something, if it hasn't changed, that your generation will see a lot of changes in, is my guess. We all have to do a bit of cooking of the food now. If we have children, we all have to do a little bit of cleaning of their bottoms when they dirty themselves, whether they're men or women. And there's a different kind of a development that has happened in Western societies about the nature of the relationship between men and women as partners within marriage and in life and so on, compared to my parents' generation. And that's certainly, I'm sure, one of the things to do with education and change that will happen. On the EU-Ukrainian part, what can the benefits be? It seems to me, given the amount of time I have, I don't want to get lost in a lot of detail, so let me give a few kind of pointers, what do I think are some things that point a direction. I mentioned to you earlier how Poland and Ukraine were very similar in 1991, and how the outcomes in Poland today are very different. This doesn't mean that Polish politics doesn't have enormous contest. It does. But the outcomes are better, and the generation saw a change. So I would say the first gift of the engagement is to look at pathways to transform and to modernize. And we know they work because other people have travelled the pathway before you and have benefited from the results. So this is not made up in my head. I don't have the data here, but I have given speeches about the level of economic growth and development that has occurred in the countries of Central Europe over the period of transformation. Not overnight, but over the period of which we speak. So I think the first part of the engagement, if I go back to your analogy, if it was a man and a woman, and if they're married and in then a long-term partnership, they take the long view about them as a couple and where they go in their life. And in this case, the partnership is a pathway towards successful transformation because others have been on that path and have succeeded. I think a second element, and to me it's not secondary, it's the third or fourth time I mentioned it today, is an understanding that people make a difference, but that good institutions offer continuity. Good people also need good institutions for the society to work fairly and properly in the interests of the nation. And so the pathway to improving the quality of institutions, how a government proposes and makes a law, how a parliament operates and how transparent it is, how it fights through ethics, bad behaviour or corruption inside its own institution, how people go about making medium to long-term budgets to finance national development and investment. All of these things matter. And there is a great experience and a diverse experience, a big menu to choose from. And that European menu, and from elsewhere, is open to Ukrainians to learn from. And I think in this, the pathway to transformation is one. I think the strong institutions is another one. And the other issue is a strong belief in what I would call the rule of law. That nobody is above the law. From the highest in the land to the least important citizen, the law should operate without fear or favour. There was a debate at the Yalta European Strategy a few years ago, where one of the Russian speakers was saying, don't look to EU, don't sign the association agreement, because we are your brothers in culture and in religion, in history, in language, and we, he said, will give you love. And some kind of love you had in Crimea. But this was what he told. And Carl Bildt at the time was there, and was then at that time Swedish Foreign Minister, and he said, I don't know if we give you love, but we can give you something that might be more important for you today. We can give you law. And the idea of having a system which is independent and robust, which isn't hidden, which isn't favouring vested interests, but which tries to look at the national good, this really matters. Now, these are three abstract things I'm telling you, but they produce very real results. Pathways to transformation, strong and independent institutions, and the rule of law. And those three elements are three strong things that can help to make Ukraine a better place. On the institutions and civil society, I didn't remark earlier, but I should have done, that we had the opportunity, but limited to Kyiv, to meet quite a number of representatives of national civil society organisations. We were not outside Kyiv on our mission, but we did meet with civil society and consult. And tomorrow, I'm pleased to say we have a chance to share the platform with Ukrainian civil society to discuss the RADA reform programme, which is the main speaking engagement that I have tomorrow with Mr. Plenković, precisely because we value what you say. But I do think that it is a real challenge how to take it outside Kyiv and bring it down into the different regions and the different cities. I think it really does matter that more than just a kind of a Kyiv circle should know what happens. And that indeed is a topic perhaps that we may get a bit of feedback on tomorrow. I know some work is planned on this. I don't know the detail, but I think it's an important point. And then more generally on information, I might even say on disinformation, I think the EU has not been great. I remember when I was here before Maidan, I was here on some of the issues about justice and former ministers who were in prison. And I made many mission visits here. I spent most of my time in penal colonies, or in courtrooms, or in hospitals, and some of my time with the former Prosecutor General and his staff. And when we were doing that work, I saw some of the information spending that came financed from Moscow, telling if you vote for the association agreement, that the price of using the underground system here to go to work would go from the hryvnia price to the euro price, which then would have been 10 times dearer, and today 30 times dearer. Now this stuff was complete nonsense. But there wasn't a counter-campaign on the European Union side to fight that disinformation. So I think these tools of communication are very important. And my answer to you honestly is I think so far they are underdeveloped and underexploited. And I think it is an interesting thing. And I do agree with you that it's important to bring civil society into this conversation, but it's important that Ukrainian civil society touches the universe, which is Ukraine, and not just the center of power, which is Kyiv. So, I've run out of time. I have to get on with my schedule. As I told you at the beginning, to start with you today, to me, was very important. I want to wish you, wherever your life brings you in the future, all the success that you have earned and that you can deserve, and that your success will coincide with the success of your country. And I do finish with that point that I said from Kennedy, which I would say to you, keep in your mind. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. That will give a different kind of active citizenship that your country did not know in the past. And active citizens who take on responsibilities in whichever area of life and whichever territory within the country. That's what you can bring to this. And if you bring that, you become part of the chemistry of change. And if you're part of that, that's how you change the attitudes and succeed. So thank you all very much indeed.
Зараз